right, folks, here is the legal genius who is going to help us make sense of how Jeff Sessions' move, changing and cracking down on marijuana at the state level in states that have legalized it, is actually going to play out or likely to play out on the ground. I'd like to introduce you all to Professor Ilya Somin of George Mason University Law School.
Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Just so you know, folks, Professor Somin is someone I hold in the highest esteem as a brilliant libertarian scholar in general and legal and constitutional scholar in particular. You can actually catch a lot of his commentary in the pages of the Washington Post, and I strongly recommend you check it out. Professor, just to get an overview of the whole issue, what would you say are the ramifications of the Justice Department's move for federalism and marijuana policy?
As you probably know, the cause of marijuana legalization has been gaining steam in recent years. 8 states have now legalized recreational marijuana. I think there may be a 9th, even just within this week or the next few days in the case of Vermont, and others are considering it. Something like 29 states have legalized medical marijuana. But meanwhile, marijuana is still illegal under federal law. Even possessing a small amount of marijuana is illegal under federal law, even if it's for medical purposes. But obviously, this federal law is only relatively rarely enforced. Back in 2013, the Obama administration considered how they were going to react to these new states which had legalized recreational marijuana. At that time, I think just 2 of them, because when states legalize recreational marijuana, that means now, at least under state law, marijuana businesses that produce and distribute the drug can operate in the open. And like, so in principle, they could be tempting targets for federal law enforcement agencies. And the Obama administration, after much consideration, put out this memo from the Department of Justice known as the Ogden Memorandum, which said, we're not saying that federal prosecutors should never prosecute the possession or distribution of marijuana in states which have legalized it. Rather, we're saying that we discourage such prosecutions except in cases where there are certain federal interests that might be at stake. Some of these federal interests, like preventing distribution to children, are actually pretty vague, and depending on how you apply them, they could be applied pretty widely. If a federal prosecutor really wanted to, they could have gone after almost any marijuana business by citing one of these federal interests in some way. Nonetheless, the Obama administration did at least send a signal that, at least as a general rule, they weren't especially enthusiastic about going after marijuana businesses and distributors in those states which had legalized it. Just last week, Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General in the Trump administration, who is a longtime drug lawyer, withdrew the Ogden Memorandum and issued a new memorandum which essentially says federal prosecutors should use just their ordinary discretion in determining when and how to go after businesses and distributors and others who are engaged in the marijuana trade, and even in states which have legalized it. So what will be the impact of this? Technically speaking, you might say the impact isn't that great because he's not actually ordering U.S. attorneys or other federal officials to go after these businesses. He's just basically saying, use your discretion, do what you want within ordinary Justice Department guidelines. However, it is at least a signal that the Justice Department is no longer going it easy on these sorts of businesses. Obviously, everybody knows, or at least everybody who follows the issue, that Sessions himself is pretty enthusiastic about the war on drugs and would perhaps welcome efforts to crack down on these businesses. So what will happen? It's not actually that easy to say. One possibility is maybe even not a whole lot will happen. Maybe the prosecutor will say, you know what, we don't really want to use this discretion. And I do think it's unlikely that the vast majority of these businesses will be targeted, in part because the federal government simply doesn't have the manpower to go after them, at least not without the assistance of state officials. But I think that's probably an over-optimistic assessment. One problem is that if even a few of these businesses are subject to prosecution, this could have a significant chilling effect. Legitimate businesses that operate in the open, unlike the Al Capones and drug gangs of the world, they're pretty scared of attracting negative attention from the authorities. So even if few are prosecuted or shut down and the like, that could have a big effect on others. Also, it could have an even bigger effect on financial institutions, which lend money and finance these organizations, that if they see that the federal government is cracking down even a modest way, those institutions tend to have a pretty conservative mindset, and they're also scared of risk. So the effect effect could potentially be significant, even if there are only a few prosecutions. Now, on the plus side, this could help stimulate efforts in Congress to repeal the federal ban on marijuana. There are now bills sponsored by both Democrats and Republicans to do this, at least to some extent. There are different bills. Some of them have greater merit than others. There is one sponsored by Republican Representative Tom Garrett of Virginia, which would end most, if not all, of the federal war on marijuana. And then there's one sponsored by Senator Cory Booker, a Democratic senator and quite possibly a future presidential candidate, that would go even further than Garrett's bill. And as I said earlier, 64% of the public now favors legalization of marijuana. Even a slight majority of self-identified Republicans favor it. However, while there's more activity in Congress on this than before, I think we're still a ways away from actually repealing the federal ban. Meanwhile, however, there will be further legalization efforts in the states. I mentioned before, it's already ongoing. And legalization in the state of California, obviously our largest state, which was voted on in a referendum in 2016, that legalization just took effect at the start of the year. So that will have a big impact. So in the long run, I think the war on marijuana is on its way out. I don't think even Jeff Sessions will be able to stop it in the long run, most likely. But in the short to medium term, it is likely to continue and may claim some additional victims, and that I think is a bad thing. Also, just the environment of uncertainty that's created by what Sessions did to some extent makes it more difficult for legitimate businesses to operate, which in turn creates more opportunities for drug gangs, criminals, and others. Jeff Sessions likes to pose as a great enemy and adversary of the MS-13 drug gang and other drug gangs, but really drug gangs are potentially among the largest beneficiaries of his kind of policies, in that the reason why people shop from drug gangs in most cases is because either there aren't legitimate suppliers, or the legitimate suppliers are so expensive because of regulatory requirements that the drug gangs can give you a cheaper product. If we really want to combat MS-13 and others of this sort, we should look to eliminate not only the war on marijuana, but the war on drugs more generally. Just as Al Capone and organized crime of the Prohibition era was the result of the prohibition of alcohol, so similarly, a lot of organized crime today, both in the US and in our neighboring countries like Mexico, a lot of that organized crime is the product of our war on drugs.
That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, there's a really pithy term for the phenomenon that the professor just described: bootleggers and Baptists. Unwitting coalitions of support for drug prohibition from those who support it because they really disapprove of drugs. That would be the Baptists, like Jeff Sessions, and those who benefit inadvertently from prohibition because it gives them, in the criminal underworld, a huge black market that they can dominate at gunpoint. Would be the bootleggers. So they may not realize it, but they're actually on the same side. Keep that in mind. So, Professor, when it comes to the federalism issues that Jeff Sessions' move raises, one thing I've always been curious about is when it comes to the supremacy clause issue. For those of you who don't know, in the Constitution, you have the supremacy clause, which states that if the federal government has constitutional jurisdiction over a particular area of public policy, if there's any state law that conflicts with it, the federal law supersedes the state law. But that leads to some confusion. There's obviously debate over whether, in fact, Congress does have the constitutional power to prohibit marijuana intrastate or even interstate. But even if we stipulate for the purpose of this conversation that Congress does have jurisdiction in that area, that still raises a question in my mind. When it comes to drug legalization, specifically marijuana legalization, even if the federal government continues to say we're going to crack down on marijuana as much as we ever did, if states where it's legal, such as California, continue to insist we're going to keep it legal in our jurisdiction, how does the supremacy clause issue come into play? Is it simply that the feds will enforce federal law to the best of their ability, however limited that may be in practice, and state and local law enforcement and courts will simply adopt a hands-off policy and the feds are on their own? Or does it mean that the state law is actually effectively wiped off the statute books at the state level because this state law is superseded by federal law? Can you clear that up for us?
Sure. So there are some complicated issues here, some of which are currently before the Supreme Court in a case we might talk about in a moment. But the basic story is this: it is true, as you say, that the supremacy clause says that federal law supersedes state law when the two conflict. However, the standard view of these state marijuana laws is that they don't conflict with the federal law. All they say is that marijuana or certain types of marijuana in certain situations are legal under state law. The fact that something is legal under state law doesn't mean that it can't simultaneously be illegal under federal law. And states are not required to ban under their own laws everything that the federal government bans. And also, they're not required to help the federal government enforce federal law. The Supreme Court has said that in several Supreme Court decisions. If the federal government forces state governments to help enforce federal laws, that's actually what the court calls commandeering. It's a violation of state sovereignty and of the 10th Amendment. However, there is this wrinkle, which is before the Supreme Court in a case involving not drugs, but actually sports gambling. Christie versus NCAA, where the federal government has this law which says that states are not allowed to legalize previously legal sports gambling, even under their own state laws. And New Jersey did try to legalize certain kinds of sports gambling. New Jersey argued that this federal law forbidding them to do this is unconstitutional because it's commandeering. But the Court of Appeals ruled that it is permissible because even though a state can't be forced to ban something under its laws, the federal government can prevent states from, quote, affirmatively authorizing certain activities. And because the New Jersey law doesn't simply say all sports gambling is legal, they say sports gambling is legal if it occurs in certain places, but not others. And it's legal if you bet on most teams, but not if you bet on certain teams that are based in New Jersey itself. Therefore, they say, well, this is affirmative authorization because it's trying to channel the sports gambling business and regulate in various ways. If this sort of distinction holds up, it could potentially give the federal government the power to block states from legalizing almost any activity that the federal government wants to prevent them from legalizing, because although I, as a libertarian, would like to legalize both gambling and marijuana almost completely, virtually every legalization law that is on the books does have some restrictions. For instance, a licensing system for which kinds of businesses can sell the marijuana and distribute it and grow it and so forth. However, when this case was argued before the Supreme Court in December, the majority of the justices seemed very skeptical about the federal government's case. It is likely, not certain, but it's likely that New Jersey will win the case and therefore reaffirm the principle that states have very broad power to legalize activities under their own law, even if the federal government doesn't want them to, and even if the activities are still illegal under federal law. In the short run, this will enable a lot of states to legalize sports gambling if they want to, but it also does have implications for marijuana and other issues. I would note one last issue here that you had alluded to, and that is there is a question about whether the federal government has the power to ban the possession of marijuana in the first place. This is supposedly permitted under Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. In the 2005 decision of Gonzalez versus Raich, which I think is one of the worst decisions in the history of the Supreme Court, at least one of the worst federalism decisions, the court ruled that the power to regulate interstate commerce is broad enough to ban the possession of marijuana, even if that marijuana never crossed state lines and was never sold in any market anywhere, even in a state. I think, frankly, this is a very bad decision, and I hope the court someday overrules it. But in the meantime, the federal government does have the power to ban the possession of marijuana, even if the marijuana was locally produced, locally distributed, even perhaps if it wasn't even ever sold to anybody. I think that's a very bad decision. It should be gotten rid of. But even if the Supreme Court doesn't do that, I think other government actors, the president and Congress, have an independent duty to consider whether what they're doing is permissible under the Constitution. And that's yet another reason why what Jeff Sessions did was a terrible idea. Even the Obama memorandum that he superseded, that memo also, in my view, actually didn't go far enough in restricting federal prosecutions of marijuana possession and the like. So I think there is a federalism issue, there's a constitutional issue. There's also, of course, the issue of whether just from a moral or practical or policy point of view, this is the kind of issue which we really need a single solution dictated by the federal government for the entire nation.
So in a nutshell, would you say that in practice, the likelihood is that in states that have legalized marijuana, local and state authorities will simply allow it to proceed, and if they face any legal risk, it's mainly from federal authorities like the FBI and the DEA and from federal prosecutors and courts?
By and large, yes. It's possible if the federal government becomes aggressive about these matters, they can also try to incentivize state and local police to cooperate with them. One of Jeff Sessions' other great enthusiasms is asset forfeitures, which is a practice under which law enforcement agencies can seize property that supposedly was used in a crime and keep it for themselves, even if the person was never convicted, in many cases, even if he or she was never charged. And Sessions, over the summer, reinstituted a federal program that the Obama administration had imposed constraints on, under which if local police forces help the federal government seize this property, then the federal government can share some of the proceeds with them. So the Justice Department could try to use the prospect of asset forfeitures to incentivize local and state police to help them go after these marijuana providers. State governments in turn could impose regulations preventing that. If I had to guess, I think under Sessions, efforts to target these marijuana businesses may increase only modestly, but even a modest increase could potentially have a significant chilling effect, the reasons I mentioned earlier. In the long run, I think it is highly likely that the federal law banning marijuana possession and distribution will ultimately be repealed, but it's hard to say. It could even happen very quickly, but it also could take some years.
Right. Just as a matter of police and criminal procedure, is it even possible or legal for state and local police officers to arrest people for violations strictly of federal law?
That is an interesting question. There are a number of federal programs which try to incentivize state and local police to cooperate in that respect. Immigration law is a big area where this happens. I think there are some others as well, but I have to admit I'm not fully expert in this particular branch of law, so I'm not fully sure what potential there is here for such actions in the case of marijuana.
I got my work cut out for me. Looks like I'll need to hunt down another law professor and help that clear up for me.
Yeah, this is the issue that keeps on giving, even for those of us like me who don't actually use marijuana. In that respect, it certainly provides a lot of intellectual opportunities.
A lot of grist for the mill, indeed. I guess that about sums up all of the issues that I wanted you to help us clear up, Professor. So I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to shed some light on these issues for me and my viewers.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. And if you could email me a link when it's up.
You absolutely have it. Thanks so much again, and I look forward to further conversations in the future in which I can pick your brain and benefit from your expertise.
Thanks so much for having me.